Okay, so really looking forward to doing this next live stream with you. We are doing genetic code. And as always, I am just going to say, chuck in your questions and your topic requests. I'm on Instagram at Biology Carol. I'm posting every Monday and Thursday, so do look that up. And please do subscribe. Gossip this channel around so that everybody gets to know that I'm here and that biology is really possible. All this like and turn on notifications I'm kind of laughing about, but actually I'm also serious because I want students to know that biology is possible. So we are doing, hi Megan, lovely to see you again. We are talking about how the genetic code works. We're talking about the triplet code and some of the maths that goes along with that. We're going to be talking about the relationship of genes, proteins and characteristics, and the relationship between genes, alleles and variation. And we're going to be nailing these terms: universal, degenerate and non-overlapping, those descriptions of the genetic code. So let's start. Hi, Amen. It's lovely to see you too. Let's start with a very brief description of the DNA double helix. This molecule is like a twisted ladder. It's by far the best description. The uprights are the sugar phosphate backbone and the rungs are pairs of bases. And rather nicely here, you can see that adenine and guanine are physically larger molecules than thymine and cytosine. And hopefully, therefore, it makes sense that they pair up, one bigger one and one shorter one, so that the rungs of the ladder are the same length. Because if they weren't, the DNA molecule wouldn't really hold together very well. Adenine pairs with thymine with 2 hydrogen bonds. OCR, you need to know that it's with 2 hydrogen bonds. Guanine and cytosine, they pair up with 3 hydrogen bonds. DNA is the most remarkable molecule. It is the best information storage device. If you consider nowadays that we store our information in digital format as a series of noughts and ones, everything from music to photographs to videos, everything is stored as noughts and ones. I read a fascinating article in a newspaper a few years back where they were saying that if all the information on the internet was stored as DNA and not digitally, it would take up the volume of a shoebox. That is extraordinary. And it tells you how powerful an information storage molecule DNA is. It is long, so it can store a lot of information. And it is by the base sequence that it is stored. So instead of digital being that sequence of zeros and ones, here we have a sequence of these 4 bases. And we're going to talk about how that works in a minute. But just to get you going about how remarkable DNA is, I hope that helps you understand it. Darcy, I had a fantastic holiday. I'm hoping you're appreciating the tan. Okay, back to DNA. DNA is universal. All cells have double helix DNA in them. I don't care whether we're talking about prokaryotes or eukaryotes. They all have the double helix DNA in them. This causes a lot of confusion because some students think that prokaryotes, the DNA is circular and therefore not helical. No, it's both. In prokaryotes, the DNA, the helix, is configured as a circle, and it is linear in eukaryotes. The DNA in eukaryotes coils up, supercoils up around those proteins called histones to make the structures that we call chromosomes. And DNA codes for proteins. And it only uses one strand of the DNA for this. If your syllabus requires you to know about the directionality of DNA, it is actually the 3' to 5' strand. If you're not required to know that, don't worry about it. It will always be known in all syllabuses as the template strand. It's the strand that is read. And it is literally read from top to bottom. But the DNA only codes for proteins. And I remember learning this when I was your age and kind of wondering, then where do all the other molecules that make up an organism's body come from? You know from your biomolecules chapter, way back at the start of AS, that organisms are made up of carbohydrates, proteins and lipids, or any combinations of them. And therefore, why on earth does DNA only code for proteins? Well, it's because proteins make everything happen in the cells. Enzymes can put together other molecules to make the lipids and to make the carbohydrates. That's why DNA only codes for proteins. And it codes for them using this sequence of bases being read from the top to the bottom of the template strand. And it is read as DNA base triplets. These are, and this is where one triplet codes for a single amino acid. Now, I've actually allocated particular amino acids. You don't need to know these names for A level, but I've put them in because it's almost as easy as anything else. But notice that the triplets are non-overlapping. The second triplet doesn't start here and finish here. It is non-overlapping. And each triplet codes for an amino acid. In this case, it's methionine, lysine, arginine, cysteine, glutamine, and phenylalanine. Again, you don't need to know those names, but I'm just indicating these are different amino acids. And if these amino acids are then bonded in the order dictated by the DNA template strand, they become the protein's primary structure, the order of the amino acids in the protein. And that, of course, determines the protein's tertiary structure and therefore its function, because a protein's function is absolutely determined by its 3D shape, its tertiary structure. And here is the primary structure of this polypeptide. Now let's talk about how the base triplets, genes, and proteins and characteristics all come together. Let's pretend that this fine drawing is a whole length of linear DNA that makes up a chromosome of us, let's say. A short section of that DNA, a short section of the DNA is one gene. And a gene, therefore, is a short section of DNA that codes for a particular polypeptide. Now, I've said polypeptide because a protein can be made up of more than one polypeptide, which you'll know from your quaternary structure of proteins. So one gene can also be called an exon. An exon is part of the DNA which is coded for, which in effect is made into proteins. It is expressed. That's why this term exon is called an exon, because it's expressed. And expressed means that it can be turned into a protein by transcription and translation. The alternative term that almost certainly you'll have come across if you've come across exon, and if you haven't come across exon, you will do, is intron, and an intron interferes. That is the non-coding DNA. Probably worth you also noting that in human DNA, less than 2% of our DNA are genes, are exons. Less than 2% is coding DNA. All the rest of it are introns. And proteins are what determine our characteristics, which is a weird kind of thought. Back at GCSE, you will have learned that the shape, one of the characteristics is the thumb shape. You will have learned that thumb shape is coded for by a single gene, a single protein. So isn't it a weird thought that somebody that has, you know, those silly curly thumbs, clearly mine aren't silly because they're straight, but the silly curly thumbs, the difference between a straight thumb and a silly curly thumb is one protein. Extraordinary. But many, and yes, proteins determine characteristics of the cells. And that's because, as I've said, proteins make everything happen in cells. I call them the machinery of the cells. Think about the machinery in a factory. The machinery in the factory will determine what that factory makes, the function of the factory, and it often determines what the factory or the cell looks like. So proteins determine what cells look like and what they do, what their function is, and therefore by extension does it make sense that they also determine what tissues and organs look like and what they do, and actually therefore what whole organisms look like and how they function. Notice that most characteristics are actually determined by many more than one gene. Many of them come together to decide on what a particular characteristic will look like. A classic example for humans would be hair color or skin color. The triplet code, let's talk about a little bit of the maths here. As we saw earlier, the DNA template strand is read from top to bottom in groups of 3, the triplet code, and this determines the primary sequence, the primary structure of a polypeptide. But notice the maths here. It's simple, but it can be confusing. 3 bases code for 1 amino acid. Notice the terminology here. You cannot say that 3 bases make or produce an amino acid because they don't. They code for an amino acid. But that means that therefore 30 bases would code for 10 amino acids. But let's make sure we get this the right way round. 30 amino acids require 90 bases for their coding. Hope that makes sense. You've got to get it straight in your head which way round that multiplication or division by 3 occurs. But why do we have a triplet code? Well, this was worked out almost immediately by Crick and Watson, who discovered the structure of DNA when they realized that the bases were paired up in the center of the DNA. And it is a matter of maths, because they know, as you might know, that we have 20 naturally occurring amino acids. So Crick and Watson knew that they had to be able to read this code somehow so that 20 amino acids could be specifically coded for. Now, if the code was made up of one single base, does it make sense that only 4 amino acids could be coded for because we only have 4 bases? However, and that is 4 to the power of 1. If we have 2 bases as the code, that gives you, and I've drawn them out here nicely systematically, 16 possible combinations. It's still not enough to code for 20 specific amino acids. And it was that basic maths logic that made Crick and Watson realize that it must be a triplet code. because that means that there would be 4 to the power of 3 combinations, which is 64. 4 times 4 times 4. And that means we've got enough for the 20 specific amino acids and 44 codes left over. And what they discovered was that it means that each amino acid has at least 1 triplet code. And I haven't written it in, and in addition, there are stop codes too. Because the most often used amino acids have the most codes. And that code, can I just reiterate, is universal across all organisms. The same code that decides that codes for methionine in a bacteria codes for methionine in us. And that tells you that DNA is one of the molecules that was produced or was brought together right at the start of evolutionary history, because all organisms share it as their genetic storage device. So going back over those crucial descriptions of the DNA genetic code, the genetic code is universal. All organisms have DNA and they all have the same code. It is non-overlapping. Each base is only in one base triplet. It is a triplet code, and that simply means the root of those bases code for amino acids. And it is also degenerate. Don't quite know where this word has come from, but that means that each amino acid has at least 1 triplet code. You need to be aware of these descriptors for the genetic code and these explanations of the description. Description, explanation. And finally, let's look at the relationship between genes, alleles, and variations in characteristics. Organisms, all organisms, have so many different characteristics. In bacteria, there might be a difference in flagella length. In plants, there might be a difference in petal colour. In birds, a difference in beak length. In mammals, a difference in fur colour or length, or in our case, humans, in hair colour. Or in any organism, there might be differences in the way that enzymes are active, whether they are more active or less active, or whether receptors on cells are present or not. All of these are different characteristics. There are thousands of them in each species. And these characteristics are determined by genes. Thumb shape, determined by genes. Hair color, determined by genes. Muscle strength, in some part, determined by genes. Every characteristic is determined by genes. But each characteristic has its variance. I have blonde hair, you may well have dark hair. I've got sort of murky, bluey grey eyes, you may have gorgeous green or brown eyes. Each characteristic has its variance. But that's because of alleles. Alleles are different forms of genes, and they come about as a result of mutations. And mutations are changes in the DNA base sequence, giving rise to proteins that might be different if mutation has happened, or might not be. Now, if the protein is different, it might be advantageous. A particular enzyme might work more efficiently. And that might lead to increased survival of that individual. Or it might be disadvantageous. It might not work so well, and therefore it might lead to a decreased survival of that individual. They might die before they reproduce. Or the mutation might make no difference whatsoever, in which case, who cares? Individuals of the same species share the same genes. I have exactly the same genes as you do. What is different between us is that we have very different combinations of alleles, which is why I am completely unique genetically, and so are you, because each of us have a completely unique combination of alleles, which gives rise to different variations in each of our characteristics. We have the same characteristics, but we have lots of variation within those characteristics. And this gives rise to variation within species. Obviously, different species have different sets of genes, and therefore there is plenty of variation between species, inter-specific variation. But it's the alleles that bring about the intra-specific variation. And this variation is what leads to natural selection and therefore to evolution. I've just wanted to make, I've pretty much finished now, but because DNA is so central to biology, it of course links with many of your different topics that you either have covered or will cover in your A-level. And I just want you to be able to make those links, and by understanding clearly how the genetic code works. And I hope that has been helpful. So if you have any questions now, start furiously typing, but I'm hoping that we have covered how the genetic code works, the fact that it is overlapping, it is universal, it has a triplet code, and it is degenerate, and how those proteins that DNA codes for brings about characteristics in organisms, and within one species, how alleles, which come about as a result of mutations, bring about the very many variations in each of those characteristics that are shared within a species. Would you be able to explain alleles again? Absolutely. Alleles are different forms of the same gene. And there are different forms of the same gene. So if you imagine that a gene's, let's just say a really simple gene's code is this, wouldn't be this simple. Don't even know if have I got multiples of 3? No, I haven't. Let's put another one on the end. Let's just say this was, the gene that decided hair color, for example. What you might get, actually, an allele of that might be this. Now, I don't know the genetic code off the top of my head, but this triplet here, this might, let's say this one codes for the protein methionine. This might code for the amino acid. This triplet, where it's been where the DNA has been mutated, might code for a different amino acid. Now that might make the protein either work better, it might make it work worse, or it could make no difference at all to the protein. And therefore, if we're talking about hair color, it's possible that this change here, this is still the same gene, but different alleles. And this, for example, and I'm making it up here, might give rise to blonde hair, whereas this might give rise to dark hair. Now, given a particular environment, it might be that dark-haired individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce, in which case I'm going to die out pretty soon. Or individuals with blonde hair will die out. And therefore, the species will evolve to have dark hair. I hope that makes sense. You're very sweet. Finn M. Davis. Thank you very much. And I hope that makes sense to you, Simply Bubbly, about how alleles work. I know it's a bit weird, different forms of the same genes. They're slightly different variants of the same gene, which bring about slightly different variations of the characteristic that the gene is coding for. Great, good stuff. If there aren't any others, I'm going to let you once again go off and have your cups of tea or glasses of Coke or whatever it is to take a break. I'm seriously wondering about whether I shouldn't be doing these in the morning now, given that for most of you, I'm guessing holidays are now well and truly happening. And I'm wondering whether 5 o'clock is now no longer the best time to be doing these. May well put a question up on the community tab of YouTube. So do feel free to go and vote there because I think it makes sense for these to happen at the best time possible. Really lovely to be back and looking forward to seeing you next Thursday to do another little topic of AS biology. Haven't decided yet what that's going to be. I haven't quite got into the groove yet. But until then, I'm going to say goodbye and look forward to seeing you next Thursday.